everyone. I'm Kim Bremer, your host today for another edition of Bova News, keeping you up to date on the cattle industry's latest in technology, management, genetics, and more. The discussion of what type of beef cattle to raise continues to be one we have a lot of interest in, especially after a focus on feedlots report by the University of Kansas was published back in May. According to the April closeout data in this report collected from 6 large Kansas feed yards, the information showed the cost of gain was $14.47 per hundredweight higher for heifers than steers, and the death loss was 0.52% higher in heifers than steers. These are significant numbers when it comes to the feed yard's bottom line. And today we have Dr. Justin Waggoner, a beef systems specialist at Kansas State University Southwest Area Extension Office, joining us. Justin is on the team who publishes the Focus on Feedlots reports and is here to talk to us about the reports and what this means for the profitability of feedlots. Justin was raised on his family's farm in central Kansas and obtained his bachelor's degree and master's degrees in animal science from Kansas State University. He completed his doctorate in ruminant nutrition at New Mexico State University in 2007, where his work evaluated the impacts of morbidity on performance and profitability in feedlot cattle and nutrient utilization in stress cattle. Justin assists beef cattle producers in all sectors of the industry by providing them with information regarding nutritional and management strategies that improve profitability. He also continues pursuing his research interests regarding the influence of nutrition and management practices on cattle health and performance. Welcome, Justin.
Well, thank you for the introduction. I certainly appreciate that, Kim. So today we're going to be discussing some of the trends that we have seen in the Focus on Feedlot data that we have collected here at Kansas State University. We're going to more broadly discuss some of the trends in the cattle feeding industry, as well as some of those relative differences between the steers and heifers that we've seen in this data set. So just kind of some housekeeping here to really orient everyone to the Focus on Feedlots and what that program really consists of here at Kansas State University. So the Focus on Feedlots is really a feedlot closeout and cost of gain performance summary. We collect data from typically 6 to 7 commercial feed yards in Kansas each month. Currently, we have the data archived electronically from 1990 to 2022. We have approximately a little over 8 million head of steers and 8 million head of heifers that are captured in the data. Typically on each month, we'll capture closeout information on somewhere between 20 to 25,000 head of steer calves that have closed out and around 15 to 20,000 head of heifers each month. Now, the Focus on Feedlots, I'm just one of the recipients or one of the guardians of this data set. I certainly did not start it. If you paid attention to the introduction, I certainly wasn't in my current position when this was started. It began as a feed yard newsletter in the late 1970s, is what we can surmise from the very early reports as we go back. There's been a number of Kansas State University faculty members that have been associated with that, including Phil Farr, Larry Cora, Jerry Cool, Jack Riley, Chris Reinhardt, as well as several others during the duration of this data set. Our current feed yard contributors right now are very much so in the western half of Kansas. So High Plains Feed Yard, Pokey Feed Yard, Deseret Cattle Feeders, Pratt Feeders, Hoxie Feed Yard, as well as Brookover Ranch Feed Yard will be the primary yards that are represented in that. One of the things that's really unique about the Focus on Feedlot is that it is the only publicly available source of feedlot closeout and performance data that's really available to producers, academia, and allied industry reps. So it does see a lot of use, and we're very fortunate in that we do have great relationships with these feeders to be able to share this data with us. And so what I'm going to go through today is some of our long-term trends from that data from 1990 to current to 2022. And then within that data, we'll make some comparisons of steers versus heifers to really give the audience a feel for what the performance differences, at least in our data set, might be between those steers and heifers. So if we look at market weights from 1990 to 2022, really to current month here, we can see an upward trajectory there. If you're familiar with the beef cattle feedlot industry, we certainly know that our live weights have increased. Steers in the 1990s were around 1,200 pounds. The heifers were around a little over 1,000 pounds. In our closeouts today, we're looking at steers that would be marketed at an exit weight of approximately 1,450 pounds, and the heifers would be marketed closer to 1,300 pounds. So that's an about a 250-pound live weight increase from that duration of time from 1990 to 2020 here that's represented. So that 30-year trend line, we can certainly see some upward movement in that. If we think about the difference between the steers and heifers, month in and month out, what we would typically see in our data set would be 150 to 200 pounds of live weight difference, with the steers being heavier than what the heifers would be. As we look at some of the more classic feedlot performance type information, average daily gain, the trend line here is increasing as well. If we go back to the 1990s, our steers were gaining approximately 3 pounds a day, heifers at 2.75 pounds. More recently, we look at 2020, the yearly summary, we would be around 3.6 on the steers and 3.2 on the heifers. So that's about a half a pound of an improvement in terms of average daily gain, representing that 30-year trend line. We look at the difference between steers and heifers. That's also about a half a pound. In the 2020 data, we can see that goes from 3.2 to 3.6 that's represented here. And really, if you look at that, the trend line and those differences between the steers versus the heifers in this data, that's been that difference of about a half a pound has been very consistent, really over time, at least in the data that we've collected from these yards. If we go to days on feed, really what's interesting about days on feed is it has increased, but it certainly doesn't have the increasing slope that we would have seen for both market weights as well as the average daily gain numbers. There is a little more variability here in this line. If you look at the peaks and valleys, 1990, our average days on feed for really both steers and heifers is really hovering around 140 days on feed. If we look at 2020 averages, we'd be around 179 days on the steers and 175 days on the heifers. So we've certainly seen an increase in days on feed, which we would expect due to the fact that those live weights have increased in both cases. But really very similar days for all means and purposes between both steers and heifers when we compare them directly. If we look at feed efficiency, so really that classic measurement of feed to gain in the feed yard, this is one where we do see some spikes in the data if you're looking closely at those graphs. Most of those spikes would be simply related to weather events that we would experience in western Kansas, where obviously if we have an exceptionally cold and wet winter, we know our feed conversions are going to increase. And so that's why we see some of those spikes here in this particular graph. In the 1990s, our average feed conversions were 6.5 to 1 on, so 6.5 pounds to produce a pound of gain on the steers, and 6.75 pounds of feed to produce a pound of gain on the heifers. If we go to 2020 in our data set, we're really looking at around a 6 to 1 feed conversion on the steers and around a 6.5 to 1 feed conversion on the heifers. Now this has increased, and so a decrease in feed conversion or feed efficiency would be a positive benefit, right? And so we do see that the heifers do not convert as well as the steers here in this data set, and that's fairly consistent across time. If you look at the height of the pink line versus the height and slope of that blue line that would represent the steers there. So if we move into death loss, this is one of the challenges, I think, for our industry right now as a whole in the feedlot industry. Now, the death loss data that we have in our data set really only represents from 1994 to present day. Prior to that, they did not report death loss in the publication or in the summary. And so in the 2000s, our average death loss was 1.4 on the steers and 1.3 on the heifers. In 2020, we're seeing average death losses of around 1.5 and 1.8% in terms of the steers versus the heifers. Now, one of the things you'll notice is that the death loss in heifers is slightly higher than what we typically experience in the steers. If we think about steers versus heifers, there's obviously going to be some more challenges in terms of pregnancy and maybe some additional death loss. But the one of the trends that we do see is that this death loss is increasing slightly within the industry, and that it does tend to be higher for heifers versus steers. So that is certainly something to take into consideration as we begin to really make that comparison between steers and heifers and feedlot performance. In terms of cost of gain, and this was alluded to in the introduction, that there are some differences there. If we look at 1990, cost of gains would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 cents. We are certainly nowhere near that territory today. Even our cost of gains that we averaged for 2020, looking at that 30-year trend line, would be in the 80s to 80 on the steers and 86 on the heifers. So, we do typically see higher cost of gains in the heifers versus the steers. And now, something else to keep in mind with the cost of gain data that's presented here, this is not adjusted for inflation. So this is just the data that was reported by those feed yards within the current year. But nonetheless, in terms of cost of gain, just due to the increased death loss, lower performance, to some extent, those would all be represented in this cost of gain within the heifers. But there's about a $6 advantage to the steer in the feedlot in terms of cost of gain. And so, just to briefly summarize what we've seen in our data here at K-State, essentially over the last 30 years of collecting this data for the Focus on Feedlot data set, is that, if we compare steers versus heifers, those steer calves are going to be 150 to 200 pounds heavier at slaughter. In today's industry, we're looking at steers that are going to be harvested at approximately 1,450 pounds, maybe somewhere in the nature of 1,300 pounds on the heifers. Steers are also going to have an advantage in terms of average daily gain, gaining about a half a pound more per day than steers. If we look at the feed conversions as well, we're looking at about a 6.5% efficiency advantage back to those steer calves. Essentially in our data set, we're looking at around an average of a 6-to-1 feed conversion for a steer and a 6.5 to 1 feed conversion on the heifers. As we talked about earlier, one of the large challenges that we've been able to pick up for the industry, I think, in our data, is that there does appear to be a bit of an increasing trend in terms of death loss, that we are experiencing higher death loss than that trend is certainly increasing, and it is generally higher for heifers than steers. I can tell you in our current data set today, for the June closeouts, and both steers and heifers, we experienced well above a 2% death loss reported in those feed yards, and that is certainly higher than the 1.5% average that we would experience year in, year out in terms of that data set. Now, one of the other things that we also collect and are able to do with the Focus on Feedlot is we also record anticipated or projected cost of gain that feed yard managers are currently placing for cattle that are being placed on feed by feedlot managers and by cooperators and owners. And so we can use the relationship between corn price and that projected cost of gain data to build some projection models for both steers and heifers. And so I thought I might share some of that data as well. Now, this is really represents a 10-year trend line, so from 2009 to 2019 here. And so in terms of the forecasted cost of gain and the regression here for steers, for every $1 change in corn price, our cost of gain on a steer moves $11.16 per hundredweight. Now, if we look at the same data for heifers, we can see that for every $1 change in corn price, cost of gain moves about 11.57. So we talked about that there certainly is that around a $5 to $6 difference on average between steers and heifers in terms of actual closeout cost of gain. That as we get into these projected cost of gain numbers, there's some differences there, but they are a little closer together than what we certainly might expect. Now, if we take all those values and we put them in a table with projected corn price, and the first thing that jumps out at me as I look at this slide is that we're talking about a corn price range from $2 to $7. Obviously, maybe I need to increase the range of corn prices here on this slide today. But if we look at this upper end of the corn price spectrum and what we would project based on our data between the difference of a steer and a heifer, our projected cost of gain on a steer today, if we were at $7 corn, for example, would be $111 per hundredweight, and would be about $121 on the heifers. So there you see that difference, really begins to show up in this projected cost of gain data within the focus on feedlots. And so if you are interested in receiving the focus on feedlots or finding out more information about what we do here at Kansas State University in terms of our extension team and the programs that we put together, really our one-stop shop on the web for everything is ksubeef.org. You can find the monthly focus on feedlot reports there. We also distribute the focus on feedlots directly to an email listserv each month. And so if you would like to receive the focus on feedlots directly to your inbox, all you have to do is simply send me an email at jwagon@ksu.edu, and we would be happy to get you added to our listserv so that you can receive the focus on feedlots directly to your inbox. And so I'd certainly like to thank the Bovie News team for inviting me to discuss this topic and kind of share some of the data that we've collected in terms of our trends in the Kansas feedlot industry, and some of the differences that we've been able to see in terms of the performance differences between steers and heifers.
Excellent. Thank you, Justin. So a few questions for you. From the feed yards you work with, would you say they prefer to raise steers over heifers?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it to some extent depends on the nature of the feed yard. Obviously, if you're a commercial feed yard, you feed out the customer cattle on a custom basis, right? And so you may not have control over what's certainly going to come into the feed yard. I think from a management perspective, there's certainly some advantages to the steer calves, right? We don't have, we know there's some performance differences as we've detected. We know that we certainly do have some higher death losses. And so I think from a management perspective, absolutely there is some pluses in terms of those steer calves. But it really, in terms of a preference, there probably are some feedlot calf buyers that would put calves on feed that would certainly prefer steers over heifers, and although some may have a preference for heifers as well, and we know there's some price differences there as well at different times in the marketplace, but certainly from a management perspective.
Mm-hmm. What would you say calf buyers are looking for when they're buying groups to raise out?
Yeah, another really great question. I think if we we really think about what would we want in a set of calves coming in the feed yard, and a big part of that comes along in knowing the history of those calves, where they've been, what vaccinations they've had, really what the management has been behind those calves. And then I think probably the second item that I would really encourage uh, people to consider that are raising calves is consistency within that group. What's the weight spread? What's the variability, both in terms of type and kind of those calves that are in there? So maybe just a little bit more in terms of not so much do they all weigh 550 pounds within and having less than 100 pounds difference in terms of weight spread in the pen, but making sure we have some consistency, known history, and some quality within those calves. What's the expected performance outcome associated with a particular set of calves? I think those are the things that we're beginning to see more and more value placed on within the feed yard industry.
Let's talk a little bit about beef on dairy. That's become an increasing trend in the industry. What do you see as the benefits of this trend?
Yeah, it's interesting how these trends begin to evolve over time. The concept of crossing beef cattle genetics onto a dairy animal is certainly not new, but what's changed is the quality of the bull power that we're beginning to see in some of those. And so I think that is a game changer. really for the industry. If we think about the potential for beef on dairy, the dairy cow would represent one of the largest cow herds in the nation, right? And so they're also there's a lot of similarities, there's a lot of homogeneity within those genetics there as well. And so, as we begin to think about, producing a consistent quality, producing a calf that we have a known history on, we know the vaccination status, we know the management of, I think those are all some strengths that really the beef on dairy crosses are beginning to bring to the table, and we're really starting to see some opportunities there, and people are taking a second look at that as well.
So do you think it's going to continue to evolve?
I actually do. I think there's it's I think we know from the numbers that it certainly has increased in the past few years in terms of the use of beef semen on those dairy cows. And I think as we further begin to develop that system for those calves, that we'll continue to see more of that. They are very consistent. They offer that known history of those calves, and as we find out and establish what beef genetics are going to work the best on those dairy crossbreds, I think we will see more. I know there's certainly a lot of interest from the cattle feeding side in terms of the value of those crossbred animals.
How about the male sexed semen? Do you think there's a benefit in calf creators using male sex semen?
Well, one of our objectives today was to really try to parse out some of those differences between steers and heifers. And so, if we look at those performance advantages and some of the management considerations of steers versus heifers, if a particular calf raiser or calf producer, as you put it, can make that work in terms of the economics and all of the things that go into that, absolutely. And will those calves have more value? We already know there's some value differentiation in the market typically between steers and heifers, that do take into account some of those performance differences, right? And so in the back of my mind, but absolutely, I think it's something that continues to evolve in terms of the success and the cost and all of those things. And if we factor all of those things in and there's a return on those investments, absolutely, it's something that producers should look at.
Do you see any major changes happening within the feed yard industry?
We are certainly becoming, we've seen more consolidation, right? Our yards, here in Kansas, we tend to have a number of corporate feed yards. Obviously, all of those things in terms of consistency, sourcing cattle and those type of situations, those are some of the things we're seeing more and more of. We're also, we've always been sensitive to what our consumer certainly would like to see in terms of the product that we produce. You can look at the beef on dairy animals as maybe a really great example of that. We know there's value in producing, a quality, wholesome product that's going to fit a particular target within the food service industry or whatever's downstream in terms of the consumers for those animals. And so I think those are all bigger picture trends. And as we look at some of those things that we've talked about that we're seeing some increases in, that those are evidence of some of those increased influences that we're starting to see. A lot of talk about environment, sustainability, just like all of the industries right now. We're all having those similar conversations about carbon and what our status might be and where we fit in those particular opportunities that may or may not be there. So those are continuing to evolve, right? So those are some changes that I think are on the horizon for us in all segments of the livestock industry, really.
Yeah, well said, Justin. And that's what we do, continue to evolve and change and improve. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your invaluable expertise and experience. Don't forget to subscribe to the Bova News channel on YouTube, find our Bova News podcasts on your favorite listening platform, or find more information at bovanews.com. Thanks for tuning in with us today, and we'll see you next time on another edition of Bova News.